Well, hello, dear students. Unfortunately, this is what we've been reduced to. Um, Obviously, I'm not going to get dressed up for these things, although I did brush my teeth, which is very important for you, I know. Um, I hope everybody's doing okay. Um, I think we're all struggling in some ways, but I hope that you're well. And I know it seems in some ways kind of absurd to carry on with this semester, to carry on with this course, with everything going on around us. And I've been thinking about that, and I just have a couple of things real quickly that I want to say about that. The first is I think that all of us need something to keep us occupied, and I don't think sitting around all day and binge watching is probably the best thing for our physical or mental health. So, this gives us at least some point of continuity with what our lives were like before all this madness. So, that's the first point. The second point is that many of these writings that we've read, writings that we will read, deal with things of the utmost importance, at least if you're a believer. And this is a time to be thinking about first things that matter the most to us. And so I don't think that even though we're going to read some still challenging, technically difficult material, the material is ultimately about the things I think that matter the most to us. And the third thing is that in a rather kind of startling way, our new world has brought us into a new world that is more like the Middle Ages in some ways than we might feel comfortable with. And, it's I feel somewhat compelled to point out that our current two theologians, so Bonaventure and Thomas Aquinas, these were two thinkers. Their lifetimes were almost completely coterminous, and both of them lived. Well, Thomas Aquinas probably did not turn 50, and Bonaventure died in his early 50s. This was a world, the Middle Ages, a world in which death was a constant presence in life. And sadly, we're getting a little bit of a taste of that right now. I hope not in any sort of close proximity, but certainly just keeping up with the news makes that inescapable. So those are just a few reasons why I think it's worth soldiering on. Of course, we have to. I have to. You have to. This has been mandated. But I wanted to give you a couple of reasons why it might not be a waste of time for us to do this. Okay, all I'm going to say about that. The rest of what I want to do in this video is to sort of set you up for our next reading, the Thomas Aquinas reading. And I'm going to do that by sort of talking about some of the most important social and educational and religious developments that sort of created the world in which Thomas Aquinas lived, and then to talk a little bit about the angelic doctor, as he is known himself. It is really almost impossible to overstate the significance of Thomas Aquinas in church history, in the theological tradition, certainly in the Roman Catholic theological tradition. In 1879, the Pope at the time, Pope Leo XIII, issued an encyclical in which he upheld Thomas as the model of Roman Catholic theology. And so, in many ways, certainly for a period of close to 100 years, and one might argue even to this day, Thomas Aquinas was upheld as sort of the official Roman Catholic theologian. Now, no pope or figure in the church ever actually came out and sort of suggested that, he was right about everything and that he was infallible or anything like that. But there was, in the late 19th, early to mid 20th century at least, a very strong consensus in Roman Catholic circles that Thomas Aquinas was the most exemplary, the greatest theologian that the Christian tradition had ever produced. And in more recent history, in the last several decades, even among Protestants, there has been a recognition that Thomas Aquinas is a theologian well worth one's time. A few years ago, one of my friends, Ben Lee, some of you may know Ben, we went to a conference in Princeton, New Jersey, on Thomas Aquinas and Karl Barth. Karl Barth, who was a great Reformed Protestant theologian of the 20th century. And the whole conference was intended to kind of bring Thomas scholars and Barth scholars together and have a profitable conversation. So if you want to be a theologian today, certainly if you want to be a Roman Catholic theologian, but increasingly, even if you want to be a Protestant theologian, you need to have a long, sustained engagement with Thomas Aquinas. All right, I'm going to talk about Thomas more specifically in a little bit, but I want to mention two of the most critical developments that will help us to make sense of Thomas and Thomas's world. The first is one actually I'm not going to say very much about because we've already covered it to some extent in class, and that is the rise of the friars, particularly the orders of the Dominicans and the Franciscans. Thomas Aquinas, as we'll see, was a Dominican himself. We've touched on that at least, so I'm not going to belabor that. We have not talked, however, about the other really critical development, which is the rise of the universities. For some time now, I've been telegraphing to you that the universities are coming, but it's not until this point in the course that we can actually talk about the existence of universities. Now, universities did not come out of nowhere. In fact, universities were for the most part, a fairly organic development out of especially the cathedral schools that we mentioned in several junctures of this course. So for instance, University of Paris, which today is known as the Sorbonne, University of Paris evolved out of the cathedral school at Notre Dame Cathedral there in Paris. Why do universities emerge? So I'll talk about that and then a little bit about what makes universities distinctive. Universities emerged when masters, we would call them today professors, masters and students sort of got together and, for lack of a better word, unionized in order to protect their own interests. The word university comes from the Latin universitas, which means something like corporation. And in medieval Latin, a universitas was basically a guild. So you'd have a universitas of shoemakers, a universitas of blacksmiths, and so on and so forth. So these were guilds, these universities were guilds that were formed in order to protect the interest of people who were involved in that craft or trade, and to sort of control competition and control wages and the price of goods and things like that. And if you look at the educational levels of the early universities, the educational institutions, they actually correspond to the levels or the ranks through which one rises if one joins a guild. New students at universities were like apprentices. Um, and they would take classes that were taught by these people called masters. And these students were often sort of in earlier mid-teens. Once the students reached a certain level of proficiency, they would be known as bachelors. So that's where like the whole bachelor degree thing comes from. And that was roughly equivalent to being considered a journeyman in a trade, right? So if you're a journeyman clockmaker or something like that, that means you've developed a certain degree of proficiency and skill, but you have not yet mastered your trade. Only if a student goes through the entire course of university training available, and few people did this. Most people did not, just like today, most people don't get PhDs. Only people who make very bad life decisions do that. Only the people who would go all the way through the university process would come to be known as masters, as I said before. Now, why did masters and students think it was a good idea to sort of organize and form the kind of educational guild that they did? Well, masters and students were disliked by a lot of people. They often got a lot of hostility from local people. And, if you go, even today, if you go to, say, the University of Oxford and you start talking to local townies about the university and university students, you may be shocked by just the level of vituperation that exists, against these students and teachers. Um, you know, well, I won't go into why all the reasons for that, but that was certainly one consideration. Also, both, especially masters, but students as well, wanted less interference in their work from local bishops, and we'll talk in a moment about some examples of that kind of interference. So, to sort of sum it up, we could say that students wanted protection, especially from local townspeople, although sometimes townspeople needed protection from students as well, I should add that. And masters wanted autonomy. They wanted something like, now they wouldn't have used this word or this phrase, but they wanted something like academic freedom. Now that was an idea that again, was not really, there was an embryonic form at the time, but they wanted to be able to teach without having local bishops sort of breathing down their necks and monitoring their every move. So they got together, the masters and the students got together, and of course, they needed people who would protect them from rowdy townspeople or from local bishops. And for the most part, those protectors were sort of kings, and the King of France, in the case of the University of Paris, and also, perhaps surprisingly, popes. So the papacy was seen as a sort of a tool, or a mechanism for protecting the university from the local bishop. And there were reasons, by the way, why kings and popes alike wanted to promote the flourishing of these fledgling universities, because these fledgling universities were creating people, were churning out graduates, as it were, that possessed just the kind of skills that were needed for bureaucracy. And both the papacy and the royal courts of Europe at this time were growing in size, growing in terms of bureaucratic complexity. So they really wanted these institutions to thrive so that they could employ some of those universities' graduates. one last thing to say about the universities, just in terms of what made them different from what came before, and I've already touched on this, is that they did in fact offer degrees, and that was really not something that cathedrals, certainly not monastic schools, ever offered. So there was a kind of certification process involved. Well, from this point on, I just want to talk a little bit about what, in this new world of the university, what the training of a theologian would have looked like. And, a number of the theologians we'll be reading from this point on were trained in that setting. So I want to say a bit about that. The first thing to say is that if you wanted to study theology, the first thing that you would do as a university student would not be to study theology. Rather, you would get an education, first of all, in the arts, in the liberal arts. And they just talked about sort of the arts curriculum. Now, when they talk about the arts in this medieval context, and by the way, I didn't say anything about chronology, but universities really sort of begin popping up on the radar screen in the 12th century and continue to flourish on to the 13th. When we talk about the arts, we're talking mainly about the trivium. I know I've mentioned this numerous times in class, right? So we're talking about grammar, rhetoric, logic, or sometimes called dialectic. This type of education involved principally the intensive reading of texts, and really, if you wanted to complete your study, would require about 5 or 6 years. And then after you finish, you're a Bachelor of Arts. So back in the early days, in order to become a BA, right, Bachelor of Arts, it required a little bit more time than it typically does today. 4 years is the sort of normative period today. All right, so you do that, and if you're still interested in studying theology, well, then you would continue on and start studying theology specifically, which required, on average, roughly 7 more years of study. So, do the math. This is a long training course, and you can see why most people would not make it all the way to a terminal degree here. The first stage of the theology student after the arts curriculum would be to become a Bachelor of the Bible. That's formal title, Baccalaureus Biblicus. The next step would to become a Bachelor of the Sentences, and that requires some explanation. What are the sentences? Well, the sentences were actually the title of the most famous work of theology produced in the Middle Ages. A work written by Peter Lombard in the 12th century. Peter Lombard was one of the first scholastic theologians to really take up the challenge of Peter Abelard's book, Yes and No, of which we read the prologue. Between 1158 and 1155 and 1158, Peter Lombard wrote this work, the Sentences, or the full title is The 4 Books of Sentences. So this is a large work. I mean, each book is really, truly a book in its own right. And the term sentences is being used in a technical sense here to mean something like a statement found in an authoritative text. So the authoritative text could be the Bible, could be Augustine, whatever. So 4 books, and the first book sort of was just about God and God's self. The second book about creation and the history of the world until the time of Christ. The third book about the incarnation and redemption, so the saving work of Christ. And the fourth book, sacraments, the life of the church, and the last things. Okay, so eschatology. And what I mean when I say that Peter Lombard is one of the first to really tackle the challenge of Peter Abelard is that 80% of the format of the Lombard's Book of Sentences is the format of Peter Abelard's Sic et Non, Yes and No. So you have a theological question that is posed. Then you have um, citations from authorities, so Bible, church fathers, church council, so on. Some of which citations suggest that the answer is yes. Some of the citations suggest the answer is no. Now, famously, Peter Abelard just leaves it hanging right there. So the difference with Peter Lombard is, after sort of creating these two columns, these yes and no columns, Abelard actually speaks in his own theological voice and gives what he believes to be the correct answer. Now, there's no pretension here that he's having the last word, that no one can disagree with him. But he wanted to actually give an answer. And, that's really kind of what Peter Abelard was challenging people to do just what Peter Lombard did. So to sort of bring this back to our main topic, Peter Lombard's Book of Sentences becomes the primary theology textbook for the remainder of the Middle Ages, all the way up until the 16th century, the time of Luther. It's not Thomas Aquinas' works at that point that are the main textbook. It is Peter Lombard's The Four Books of Sentences. So, from the earliest days, or some of the earliest days of the universities, it was simply taken for granted that anyone who wants to presume to become a master of theology is going to have to tackle Peter Lombard's Four Books of Sentences and lecture on his Four Books of Sentences for at least a year. Okay. All right. I want to talk about something. I want to talk about sort of how the universities actually change how theology is done and written and conceived in the High Middle Ages. And so let me say a couple of things about that. The first point is one I can just very briefly dispense with. The university setting made disputation, argument, debate an absolutely essential and integral aspect of the theological enterprise in a way that it simply was not for someone like Bernard of Clairvaux. And so, you would have to regularly participate in disputations where you would have to offer your answer to a certain question and then defend it using logic, citing authorities, and that sort of thing. So that's one important difference. I want to dwell a little bit longer on another difference, another difference that universities make, and that has to do, broadly speaking, with theology's relationship with philosophy, but more narrowly speaking, theology's relationship with Aristotle, which, before this period was not much of a relationship at all. One of the most significant achievements of the medieval university was to help disseminate the works of Aristotle and incorporate them into the theological enterprise. Now, this is something that only really happens towards the end of the 12th century and into the 13th. Prior to 1150 or so, the only works of Aristotle that were available in the West, that were available in Latin translation, were his logical works. Okay, so not the metaphysics, not the ethics, not many of his most famous works today. Now, meanwhile, and there's going to be a video lecture about this a little later, Muslim scholars, and a little bit later Jewish scholars, are going to be very busy reading, translating, commenting on all the works of Aristotle. And so finally, by the early 13th century, so, a little bit before the time Thomas Aquinas was born, Bonaventure too, most Western scholars now could have access to most of the works of Aristotle in Latin, okay, in a language they could read, because again, there's just not many Western scholars who can read Greek at this point. Now, this was a development that was certainly very welcomed by some, but also highly alarming to others. There were a number of ecclesiastical authorities and some scholars who were very wary of the enthusiastic embrace of Aristotle by Christian theologians. And indeed, this whole infusion of Aristotelian works raised some pretty vexed and difficult questions about the relationship between faith and reason, the relationship between theology and philosophy. By and large, I think we can say that the Dominicans especially found this increased access to the works of Aristotle to be highly promising and something that was going to be mostly beneficial for theology. But in other quarters, people were much more leery. Franciscan theologians tended to be a bit more leery, but we can certainly find exceptions to that. Now, on the opposite side of the spectrum, there were a group who were sometimes called the radical Aristotelians. These were often members of the arts faculty rather than theology faculties, who really believed that Aristotle was, a true authority, and that thinkers, scholars should sort of follow Aristotle wherever Aristotle leads, even if some views of Aristotle fly in the face of church teaching. Okay, so there's a wide spectrum here between people who were embracing Aristotle on one end, rejecting him, and then a sort of a more critical engagement in the middle. Now, you should know that Thomas Aquinas was actually someone who wrote against these radical Aristotelians, because Thomas did not believe that Aristotle should be followed wherever he leads. If Aristotle teaches something that clearly contradicts the teaching of the church, for instance, and this was one of the hot button issues, Aristotle taught that the world was eternal. It sort of always existed in some form. It was not created in time. And for Thomas and for a lot of Christian theologians, that is clearly in conflict with what the church teaches, and therefore has to be rejected. But Thomas's attitude was, okay, well, Aristotle is going to get some things wrong. We should expect that. But that doesn't make his works worthless, and it doesn't even make them worthless for Christian theology. Now, in 1277, just to give you a sense of another kind of extreme here, the Bishop of Paris, I won't even give you his name, but just know the Bishop of Paris in 1277, so a couple years after Thomas died, condemned 217 different propositions. Mainly these propositions were directed against radical Aristotelians, but some of the theses that were condemned had actually been proposed by Thomas. So, just given what I told you earlier about Thomas sort of being coronated as the official Roman Catholic theologian of all time, it is interesting to note that his own bishop seemed to be quite skeptical of him during his and after his lifetime. Okay. I said I wasn't going to say very much about sort of the rise of the friars, since we mentioned that. I just want to point out that these two developments that I mentioned early on, the rise of the friars, the rise of the universities, these are not just sort of chronologically parallel developments, but these are entangled developments. Now, there were plenty of people who taught at the universities who were not mendicant friars, but many of them were. Mendicants eventually make up about 1/10 of the theological faculties of Western Europe. Now, that may not sound terribly impressive, but if you think about it, that's a significant minority. Plus, pretty much all of the great names of high medieval scholastic theology, the people who are still read today, the Bonaventures, the Thomas Aquinas, the Duns Scotuses, the William of Ockhams, these people were all mendicant friars. Some were Dominican, some were Franciscan, but all mendicants. And this tells us something about the friars and how the friars, even though the friars in some way, some real ways, belong to the monastic tradition, they, for the most part, sort of shook off monastic ambivalence about scholarship and wanted to use scholarship as a means toward their end of really converting the world. That's sort of what the friars were all about. And they thought that scholarship and scholarship pursued in the university setting was one very important means toward that end. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop now. This video has gotten long enough. I'm going to stop. I'm going to do a separate video where I just introduce Thomas Aquinas a bit more. It's not going to be as long as this one. And then there'll be the one quiz that'll cover both of these videos.